This next section is going to cover evolution, which will include spontaneous generation and more advanced evolution after that. Today, evolution can be summed up as the general belief that adding hundreds of millions of years of genetic accidents to fish can, in the end, produce humans. It is heavily rooted in mystical ideas of the churning tides of time and chance, forming all things, giving rise to increasingly complex biological machines and human consciousness itself. We start in ancient Babylon with the Dagon fish god. The Babylonians had a myth that a being emerged from the Erythraean Sea, who was part man and part fish, and thus adopted the deity into their culture in their earliest days in history. Egyptians were visually obsessed with the combining of human and animal forms. Their artwork frequently displays that of bodies of men with the heads of dogs, birds, crocodiles, and other creatures. In their artwork, monkeys are frequently depicted standing upright, possessing human characteristics, and in association with sun and moon god worship. As early as 1400 BC, the Egyptian priests worshipped Thoth, the god of science, magic, and who was depicted as a baboon. Thoth mystery schools would later manifest into the Greco-Roman Hermetic orders of late antiquity. Hermes, in fact, was a manifestation of Thoth, the bringer of science, magic, and writing. Then we move to the ancient Hindus, 1400 to 800 BC. In the ancient texts, the laws of Manu, it described that mosquitoes, gnats, lice, flies, and maggots, and other species of this sort, originate from the heat and are born of moisture. Vishnu, a god which controlled cycles of birth and death, manifested in 10 avatars, or forms, in the specific order of a fish, reptile, mammal, a half-man, half-beast, a primitive man, and a fully developed man. This progression even led evolutionary biologist J.B. Haldane to comment on its parallel with modern-day evolution. In the ancient Padma Purana texts, there was a ladder of ascent, starting with species living in the water, trees, plants, insects, reptiles, birds, mammals, then humans. In the 8th century BC, Mokshadharma Parva, it was described that physical creation was a process whereby the created objects each obtains those attributes which it had during the previous creation, and each indeed obtains repeatedly the same attributes at every subsequent creation. Then we move ahead to the ancient Greeks, to our old friend Pythagoras. Again, Pythagoras was documented as having traveled widely, studying the esoteric teachings of the Egyptians, Assyrians, and even the Brahmins. So he was exposed to all these evolutionary ideas. Professor H.G. Rawlinson says, "It is more likely that Pythagoras was influenced by India than by Egypt. Almost all the theories, religious, philosophical, and mathematical, taught by the Pythagoreans were known in India in the 6th century BC. Then we have Thales, 6th century BC. Thales is a mysterious figure and a founder of the Greek mystery schools, who was said to have studied under the Egyptians and Babylonians. Thales believed the origin of all matter is water, that all things, including life, are naturally generated from some primordial state, and thus paved the way for the school of material mysticism that would follow him into Greece and into the 21st century. Anaximander. J.H. Loewen did a lot of research on this in the 1950s. Anaximander followed the teachings of Thales. He advanced many beliefs in evolution, which were well referenced by scholars in his time. He believed that man originally resembled a fish. Because infant humans cannot survive on their own, they must have originally arose from faster developing animal species. Fish-like creatures were generated by a mixture of water, earth, and heat, and humans arose from these fish creatures, eventually bursting out of their bodies and crawling onto the land. The first living beings were generated by the heat of the sun and moisture of the sea. As they grew older, they climbed onto dry land and developed into new creatures. Xenophanes, 6th century BC. After discovering marine fossils in the ground, he formed the belief that creatures spontaneously generate out of the mud. a mixture of earth and sea. Thus life comes from the moisture over time. He stated, these were generated when all things originally were embedded and dried in the mud. Perhaps this was a foreshadowing of the widespread irrational and unscientific interpretation of the fossil record to come in the future. Too bad Xenophanes didn't have the NCSE around to champion this theory as an irrefutable fact based on the hard fossil evidence. Archelaus, 5th century BC. He affirmed that a mixture of heat and cold produced numerous lesser creatures in the water, and after many successive generations, they gave rise to higher animals and eventually produced humans. Empedocles, 5th century BC, claimed that, quote, the greater part of the members of the animals were generated by chance. Believed that many other types of past creatures must have gone extinct because they lacked the physical adaptations for survival. Plato, 5th century BC. On living things, Plato wrote, these are the principles on which living creatures change and have changed into one another, the transformation depending on the loss or gain of understanding or folly. Aristotle, 4th century BC. He continued to develop ideas about a great chain of being, or ladder of nature, whereby all of nature was directly related. He wrote that nature gradually, step by step, developed from inanimate substances to living creatures. So here we see all the themes of abiogenesis, spontaneous generation, life originating in the water, and evolution of forms. Very similar to what is being taught today. Then to change tracks here, we go to ancient China. Chinese philosophers Zhuangzi, 4th century BC, believed that life forms have an innate ability or power to transform and adapt to their surroundings. He also believed humans were subject to this process. And on to Persia. Muhammad al-Naqshbandi, 10th century, wrote that, while man has sprung from sentient animals, these have sprung from plants, and these in turn from combined substance, these from elementary qualities, and these in turn from celestial bodies. Nasr el-Din al-Tusi, 13th century AD. The organisms that can gain the new features faster are more variable. As a result, they gain advantages over the other creatures. The bodies are changing as a result of the internal and external interactions. Early humans are closer to animals by their behavior. The human has features that distinguish him from other creatures, but he has other features that unite him with the animal world and plant kingdom. Humans have developed from lower beings by means of spiritual perfection. Now going back to the ancient Greeks, Plato and Aristotle's evolutionary ideas were dispersed through the Alexandrian school in Egypt. These ideas followed through into the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, and into modern mystery schools such as Freemasonry and Rosicrucianism, where the alleged wisdom of the Pythagorean and Egyptian mystery schools were often referenced and revered in both word and symbol. The Enlightenment movement of the 18th century was largely spread through Freemasonic lodges. Voltaire, a popular French philosopher of the Enlightenment, wrote, when I first read Plato and came upon the gradation of beings, which rises from the lightest atom to the supreme being, I was struck with admiration. Lord Monboddo, 18th century Scotland. Monboddo was heavily influenced by the Pythagoreans, Plato and Aristotle. He said, the orangutan, that is an animal between a monkey and a man. He believed that man developed upwards from a quadruped animal. Erasmus Darwin. He was the grandfather of Charles Darwin. He attended the same Masonic lodges as Lord Monboddo. He wrote about Pythagoras and how his mystical beliefs, in which restless atoms are in a process of ceaseless change, giving rise to new forms of life. And Erasmus called this a scientific truth. In his text Zoonomia, Erasmus wrote, the idea of gradual generation of all things seems to have been familiar to the ancient philosophers as to the modern ones. He wrote in the Temple of Nature that organic life began in the seas. Life spontaneously generated and turned into plants and insects. wrote that all warm-blooded animals had arisen from single cells over millions of years through the accumulation of new improved attributes. It should be fairly obvious by now where Charles Darwin got his ideas. And Charles Darwin, 19th century. Basically, he repeated the same thing that all mystics have been proposing before him since ancient times. He wrote that he could visualize, quote, in some warm little pond with all sorts of salts and electricity, the spontaneous generation of the first living cell. He repackaged and resold an ancient superstitious idea that had been around for thousands of years, masquerading it as a revelation borne out by scientific methodology. Comically, Darwin used the observation of small variations in finch morphology to conclude that humans must have evolved from fish. Today we know that finch populations experience phenotypic plasticity, in which their bodies vary slightly around a mean, due to seasonal variations, a process that has nothing to do with Darwinian processes of population fixation of random variations. Just to run over modern theories of spontaneous generation, it's been advanced in many forms in recent times. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the idea that insects and bacteria spontaneously generated out of inanimate matter was still popular. Intellectuals of the time even believed mice could be generated from dirty underwear. Thomas Huxley, one of the most outspoken cheerleaders of Darwinism, suggested that long ago the living cell sprang from a non-living matter. But in Darwin and Huxley's time, the living cell was considered a mostly undifferentiated blob of protoplasm, basically a blob of jello. Today, the living cell is known to be a veritable galaxy of unfathomably complex biochemical machinery and multi-layered information networks. Regardless of the fact that life is 1,000,000 times more specified and complex than ancient man could have dreamed, modern-day scientists and evolutionists, without a shred of evidence or even a workable hypothesis, still faithfully believe the first living form spontaneously generated in the ocean or a warm pond somewhere. Exactly like the ancient mystics were proclaiming 3,000 years ago, evolutionists today continue the superstitious tradition that life randomly sprang out of the oceans and that small underwater creatures crawled out of the seas onto land and eventually transformed into humans. This is from James Shapiro, who's an expert microbiologist and geneticist. He offers us this insight. Quote, "For those scientists who take it seriously, Darwinian evolution has functioned more as a philosophical belief system than as a testable scientific hypothesis. This quasi-religious function of a theory is, I think, what lies behind many of the extreme statements that you have doubtless encountered from some scientists opposing any critical analysis of neo-Darwinism in the classroom. It is also why many scientists make public statements about the theory that they would not defend privately to other scientists like me." End quote. A confirmation bias is a tendency of people to favor information that confirms their belief. Has modern science really struck upon empirical realities of Big Bang, birth of the cosmos, evolution of living beings, spontaneous generation and life emerging from water, or are these merely reaffirmations from minds that have always followed mystery doctrines of nature's self-assembly over the very simple and self-evident truth of God's special creation? Biblical scripture informs us that humans will choose to worship creatures and the creation instead of their creator. And indeed, that is an unchanging pattern we find all throughout history and today. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Romans 1:20. Who changed the truth of God into a lie, and worshipped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. Romans 1:25.